The gunshot echoed through the valley as Eliza Davis ran, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. Her 3-year-old son clutched tightly to her chest. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. Behind her, the shouts of angry men grew louder, their accusations of theft hanging in the air like the dust kicked up by their horses' hooves. She hadn't stolen anything, but a widow with no family had few allies in these harsh lands. "Hush now, Samuel," she whispered to her whimpering child, his small face buried against her shoulder. "We're almost safe." The rushing sound of the Yellowstone River grew louder as Eliza pushed through the thick brush. If she could just cross at the shallow ford, she might lose her pursuers in the dense forest on the other side. Her cotton dress was torn and muddied, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, but none of that mattered now. Only Samuel mattered. The riverbank appeared suddenly before her, but something was wrong. The normally peaceful crossing had transformed into a churning mass of water, swollen by the spring melt. Eliza hesitated, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she glanced back toward the sounds of pursuit. "There she is," a voice called from the tree line. With no choice left, Eliza stepped cautiously into the water, gasping as the cold current tugged at her skirts. "Hold tight, Samuel," she murmured, taking another step forward. She never saw the submerged log until her foot caught against it, sending her toppling forward with a terrified scream. Samuel was torn from her arms as they both plunged into the frigid, rushing water. "My baby!" Eliza shrieked as she surfaced, frantically searching for her son in the churning waters. 20 feet downstream, she spotted his small form being swept away. Fighting the current, she lunged after him, but her sodden skirts dragged her down, pulling her under again. From the riverbank, Zachariah Jensen watched the scene unfold in horror. The 26-year-old cowboy had been tracking a stray from his employer's herd when he heard the woman scream. Without hesitation, he threw aside his hat and duster, kicking off his boots as he ran. "I ain't losing 2 lives today," he shouted, diving into the raging waters just as the woman disappeared beneath the surface again. The current was stronger than Zach had anticipated, threatening to smash him against the rocks that jutted from the riverbed. With powerful strokes, he fought his way toward where he'd last seen the child, catching glimpses of the woman's struggle as she desperately tried to reach her son. The boy was floating face down when Zach reached him, his tiny body limp. Grabbing him with one arm, Zach rolled him so his face was clear of the water, then scanned frantically for the mother. He spotted her 20 yards downstream, clinging precariously to a fallen tree that stretched partway across the river. "Hold on!" he shouted against the river's roar. With the child secured against his chest, Zach swam with the current, angling toward the woman. Her eyes were wide with fear as she watched him approach with her son. "Samuel!" she cried, her strength visibly fading as the current pulled at her body. "I've got him," Zach called. "Don't let go." He reached the fallen tree just as the woman's grip failed. Lunging forward, he caught her wrist with his free hand, nearly losing his own hold on the slippery bark. For a moment, all 3 hung suspended in the current, one heartbeat away from disaster. With a strength born of pure desperation, Zach pulled the woman closer, guiding her arm around his neck. "Hold on to me," he instructed. "I'll get us to shore." Using the tree as a guide, Zach worked his way toward the riverbank, fighting the current with every inch. His muscles screamed in protest, but the weight of the child against his chest and the woman's arm around his neck reminded him of what was at stake. When his boots finally touched the rocky river bottom, Zach staggered forward, half carrying, half dragging the woman until they collapsed on the muddy bank, all 3 gasping for breath. The woman immediately reached for her son. "Samuel!" "Oh God!" Samuel, she cried, her voice breaking as she gathered the unresponsive child into her arms. He's not breathing. Zach knelt beside them, his own breath coming in harsh gasps. Let me, he said firmly, taking the boy back. With practiced movements, he turned the child onto his stomach across his knee and firmly patted his back. Please, the woman sobbed, her hands clutching at Zach's soaked shirt. Please save him. For what seemed an eternity, nothing happened. Then the boy convulsed, coughing up water as his small body shuddered back to life. His first wailing cry was the sweetest sound Zach had ever heard. Samuel! The woman gathered her son into her arms, tears streaming down her face as she rocked him. Thank you, she whispered, looking up at Zach with eyes so full of gratitude that something shifted deep in his chest. Thank you. Before Zach could respond, shouts from the far bank reminded them they weren't alone. 3 men on horseback had reached the river crossing, their expressions dark with anger. That's far enough, thief, one of them called, raising his rifle. Zach stood, placing himself between the woman and the threat. What's this about? He demanded, his voice carrying across the water. That woman stole from Buchanan's general store, the lead rider called back. Step aside, cowboy. This ain't your business. The woman, still clutching her child, looked up at Zach with fear in her eyes. I didn't, she said softly. I swear I didn't take anything. Old man Buchanan tried to. He wanted. She stopped, shaking her head as she held her son tighter. I ran. That's all. Something in her voice, in the genuine terror in her eyes, convinced Zach she was telling the truth. He turned back to the men. The lady says different, he called, and I'm making it my business. You boys ride on back to town now. You protecting a thief, Jensen? The lead rider spat into the river. Harlan ain't gonna like hearing that. Zach's jaw tightened at the mention of his employer, Harlan Reynolds, the largest cattle owner in the territory and a man not known for his forgiving nature. I'm protecting a mother and her child, he replied. Now ride on. For a tense moment, it seemed the men might try to cross the swollen river, but a muttered conversation between them ended with reluctant nods. This ain't over, the leader warned before they turned their horses and disappeared into the trees. Zach watched until they were gone, then turned back to the woman, who was still shivering on the ground with her son. Now that the immediate danger had passed, he took a moment to really look at her. Despite her bedraggled state, or perhaps because of it, he was struck by her beauty. Her dark hair clung to her pale face, framing eyes the color of summer grass. She couldn't be more than 22 or 23, far too young to be alone in such circumstances. Thank you, she said again, her voice steadier now. You saved our lives. Name's Zachariah Jensen, he said, crouching down beside her. Most folks call me Zach. Eliza Davis, she replied, shifting her son to a more comfortable position in her arms. And this is Samuel. The boy had calmed somewhat, though his small body still trembled. His eyes, identical to his mother's, regarded Zach with solemn curiosity. We need to get you both warm and dry, Zach said, looking at the darkening sky. My camp's not far. Can you walk, Mrs. Davis? A shadow crossed her face. Miss Davis, she corrected quietly. Samuel's father. He didn't return from the war. Zach nodded, understanding in his eyes. So many hadn't returned, and those who had often came back changed beyond recognition. I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Davis. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. Without asking permission, he lifted Samuel from her arms. Let me carry him. You've been through enough. To his surprise, she didn't protest, just nodded gratefully as she gathered her sodden skirts. Zach led the way through the trees, keeping a careful eye on Eliza as they walked. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but there was a stubborn determination in the set of her jaw that he couldn't help but admire. His camp was simple: a small fire pit surrounded by rocks, a bedroll laid out beneath a canvas tarp strung between trees, and his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, grazing nearby. The animal raised its head as they approached, nickering softly in greeting. "It's not much," Zach said, suddenly conscious of the simplicity of his setup. "But the fire will warm you, and I've got dry clothes you can use for the boy." "It's perfect," Eliza said, sinking down on a log near the fire pit. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Jensen." "Zach," he corrected, setting Samuel down gently on his bedroll. "Mr. Jensen was my father, and he'd be mighty uncomfortable with the formality." That earned him a small smile, the first he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face in a way that made his breath catch. He busied himself with rekindling the fire, aware of her eyes on him as he worked. "Those men," she said after a moment, "they work for someone named Harlan?" Zach nodded, feeding twigs to the growing flames. "Harlan Reynolds owns the biggest spread in the territory, the Double R. I work for him too, driving cattle." "And yet you stood against his men for us," she said softly. "Why?" Zach paused, considering the question. "A man has to live with himself," he finally said. "I couldn't stand by and watch them harm a woman and child, no matter who signs my pay." "Will you be in trouble?" The fire caught properly, and Zach sat back on his heels. "Probably," he admitted. "But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, we need to get you and the boy dry and fed." He rummaged in his saddlebags, pulling out a clean flannel shirt. "This'll swim on you, but it's dry," he said, handing it to Eliza. "And I've got a spare blanket for the boy." "Thank you," she said, accepting the offerings. She hesitated, looking around the small campsite. "Is there somewhere I could?" "Of course," Zach said quickly, feeling heat rise to his face. "I'll take the boy down to the creek, it's gentler than the river, and wash some of that river mud off him. Give you some privacy." Relief flooded her features. "That would be kind, thank you." Samuel went willingly enough into Zach's arms, though his solemn expression never changed. As Zach carried him toward the small creek that ran 100 yards from the camp, he felt a strange protectiveness toward the quiet child. "You were mighty brave back there, Samuel," he said conversationally as he knelt by the creek. "Your ma must be proud of you." Samuel watched as Zach dipped a kerchief in the clear water and gently began washing the mud from his face and hands. "Are you a real cowboy?" he asked suddenly, his voice small but clear. Zach smiled. "I reckon I am. Do you have a gun?" "I do, but I don't use it much. Mostly on wolves or coyotes that might trouble the cattle." "Bad men were chasing us," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "They wanted to hurt Mama." Zach's hands stilled for a moment. "Did they say why they wanted to hurt your mama?" Samuel shook his head. "Mama says Mr. Buchanan is not a nice man. She says we have to be careful." "I see," Zach said, though in truth, he was piecing together a story he didn't like one bit. He'd heard rumors about old Gerald Buchanan, the shopkeeper in Rivorton, about how he treated the young widows who came to his store. Nothing proven, but enough whispers to make Zach wonder. "Well," he said, finishing his impromptu bath of the boy, "your mama's right that you need to be careful, but you're safe now. I promise." By the time they returned to camp, Eliza had changed into his shirt, which indeed hung almost to her knees, and had spread her dress and petticoats on nearby bushes to dry. Her hair was still damp, but she'd managed to comb it with her fingers and tie it back with a scrap of ribbon that had somehow survived the river. She looked up as they approached, and Zach was struck again by her beauty, somehow enhanced rather than diminished by her makeshift attire. He quickly averted his eyes, remembering his manners. "The fire's nice and warm," she said, rising to take Samuel from him. "And I found coffee in your pack. I hope you don't mind I started some brewing." "Not at all," Zach said, grateful for the distraction. He helped her wrap Samuel in the spare blanket and settle him near the fire, then busied himself with preparing a simple meal from his provisions: beans, jerky softened in the bean broth, and the last of a loaf of sourdough bread he'd purchased in town 3 days earlier. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant call of a night bird the only sounds. Samuel, exhausted from his ordeal, fell asleep halfway through his meal, curled up on Zach's bedroll like a small, tousled puppy. "He's taken a shine to you," Eliza observed, watching her son with a tender expression. "He's a good boy," Zach said. "Smart too." Eliza nodded, her expression turning serious. "Mr. Jensen, Zach, I need to tell you something about what happened today." "You don't owe me any explanations," he assured her. "I think I do, especially since you risked your job to help us." She drew a deep breath. "What those men said about me stealing, it wasn't true. Mr. Buchanan, he's been persistent in his attentions since my husband died. Today, he cornered me in the back of his store and tried to." She paused, glancing at her sleeping son. "He said no one would believe a penniless widow over him. When I fought him off, he accused me of stealing to save face." Anger flared in Zach's chest, hot and urgent. "That old bastard," he muttered, then immediately apologized for his language. "No need," Eliza said with a small smile. "I've thought worse about him." Her smile faded. "The problem is, he's right. No one will take my word over his. Samuel and I came west after the war, hoping for a fresh start. But it's been difficult." "Do you have family you can go to?" Zach asked. She shook her head. "My parents died when I was young. My husband, Thomas, was all I had, and then Samuel came along. When Thomas didn't return from Gettysburg, I sold what little we had and came west. I've been taking in laundry and mending in Rivorton, but now—" Her voice trailed off. "You can't go back," Zach finished for her. "No," she agreed softly. "We can't." Zach stared into the fire, thinking. "My sister lives in Bozeman," he said finally. "Rebecca and her husband have a small boarding house. She's always saying they need help with the cooking and cleaning. It would be a safe place for you and Samuel, at least until you decide what to do next." Hope flickered in Eliza's eyes. "Bozeman? That's nearly 2 weeks' journey from here." "It is," Zach acknowledged. "But I could take you there. I'm due some time off from the R, and after today, I reckon Harlan might be happy to see the back of me for a while." "I couldn't ask that of you," Eliza protested. "You've done so much already." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Zach met her eyes steadily. "Unless you'd rather make your own way?" For a moment, Eliza looked as though she might refuse out of pride. Then she glanced at her sleeping son, and her shoulders sagged slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. "We accept your offer." Zach nodded, oddly pleased by her decision. "We'll start at first light. Get some rest, Miss Davis. You can have the bedroll. Samuel's already claimed half of it anyway." "And where will you sleep?" she asked. "I've got my saddle and blanket," he replied, already moving to arrange his makeshift bed on the opposite side of the fire. "I've slept on worse." Eliza watched him for a moment, then said softly, "Thank you, Zach, not just for the rescue, but for believing me. That means more than you know." Their eyes met across the flames, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Zach looked away first, suddenly conscious of the impropriety of their situation. "Get some rest," he said again, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Tomorrow's a long day." Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the soft golden light of dawn filtering through the trees. Zach, who had slept fitfully, aware of every sound in the forest and the presence of his unexpected companions, woke to find Samuel sitting beside him, studying his face with solemn curiosity. "Mama's still sleeping," the boy whispered when he saw Zach's eyes open. She was crying in her sleep. Zach sat up slowly, his back protesting after a night on the hard ground. Across the remains of the fire, he could see Eliza curled on his bedroll, her dark hair spread across his rolled-up jacket that served as a pillow. Even in sleep, there was a tension in her face that spoke of her troubles. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're tired or scared," Zach explained quietly, standing and stretching. "Your mama's been through a lot." Samuel nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Are we going somewhere today?" "We are," Zach confirmed, moving to check on his horse. "We're going to visit my sister in Bozeman. Would you like that?" "Will there be other children?" Samuel asked, following Zach like a small shadow. "I believe so. My sister has 2 boys, though they're a bit older than you." Zach patted the buckskin's neck as the horse nickered a greeting. "You ever ride a horse, Samuel?" The boy shook his head, his eyes wide. "Mama says horses are expensive." "That they are," Zach agreed. "But they're also good companions. This here is Buck. He's carried me through some tough country." "Can I pet him?" Samuel asked hesitantly. "Sure you can," Zach said, lifting the boy so he could reach Buck's nose. "Nice and easy, that's it." Samuel giggled as the horse's soft muzzle tickled his palm, and the sound seemed to wake Eliza. She stirred, then sat up quickly, alarm crossing her face until she spotted her son with Zach. "Good morning," Zach called, setting Samuel down gently. "Hope we didn't wake you." "No," Eliza said, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "I should have been up earlier. There's much to do." "No rush," Zach assured her. "I'll get breakfast started. Your clothes should be dry by now." While Eliza collected her garments from the bushes and disappeared into the trees to change, Zach rekindled the fire and set water to boil for coffee. Samuel helped by gathering small sticks, his earnest efforts bringing a smile to Zach's face. By the time Eliza returned, dressed once more in her simple cotton dress, breakfast was ready: coffee for the adults, the last of Zach's oatmeal cooked into a thick porridge, and dried apples soaked overnight to soften them. "This is a feast," Eliza said, accepting the tin cup of coffee gratefully. "You're well prepared for the trail." "Years of practice," Zach said, dishing up porridge for Samuel. "My pa taught me never to ride out without provisions for at least a week. Weather changes, cattle stray, horses go lame, all sorts of things can delay a journey." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Zach agreed, a familiar pang of loss tightening his chest. "Lost him and my ma both to influenza 6 years back. That's when I came west from Illinois." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. "It seems we both know what it's like to lose family." Their eyes met briefly in shared understanding before Zach looked away, focusing on his breakfast. "We should reach the double R by nightfall," he said, changing the subject. "I'll need to speak with Harlan. Let him know I'm taking some time. Then we can stay with the bunkhouse cook, Mrs. Flores won't mind putting you and Samuel up for the night." "Will there be trouble?" Eliza asked. "With the men from yesterday?" Zach considered the question. "Pete Rollins has a big mouth but not much backing it. If Harlan doesn't take issue with what happened, Pete won't either." "And if Harlan does take issue?" Zach shrugged. "Then I reckon I'll be looking for new employment after we reach Bozeman," he said lightly, though the prospect wasn't as troubling as it should have been. The double R had been good to him, but lately he'd been feeling the itch for something different, something more permanent than driving cattle from season to season. After breakfast, they broke camp efficiently. Eliza insisted on helping, packing away the cooking gear while Zach rolled up the bedding. Samuel watched in fascination as Zach saddled Buck, asking questions about every piece of equipment. "He's normally quite shy with strangers," Eliza remarked, standing beside Zach as he tightened the cinch. "You have a way with him." "He's a good boy," Zach said again. "Smart and curious, that'll serve him well." When everything was packed, Zach lifted Samuel onto Buck's back, then helped Eliza up behind him. "I'll walk for now," he explained, taking the reins. "The trail's narrow here, and Buck's carrying enough with the three of us and our gear." The morning passed pleasantly as they made their way through the forested hills. Samuel, initially nervous on horseback, soon relaxed enough to point out birds and squirrels along the way. Eliza grew more talkative as well, sharing stories of her life back east before the war. "Thomas and I met at a church social," she said, smiling at the memory. "He was so shy he could barely ask me to dance. But once he did, we never wanted to stop. We were married 6 months later, just before he left with his regiment." "You must have been very young," Zach observed. 18, Eliza confirmed. "Too young, really, to be a wife and then a mother and then a widow. But I wouldn't trade Samuel for anything." As the sun reached its zenith, they stopped by a clear stream to rest and water Buck. Zach shared his jerky and hardtack with them, and Samuel delighted in catching tiny minnows in the shallow water. "He seems happier today," Zach noted as they watched the boy play. "He is," Eliza agreed. "You've given him something he hasn't had, much of a sense of adventure rather than fear." She hesitated, then added, "And a man to look up to." Zach felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words, though he was careful not to show it. "Any man would be proud to have a son like him," he said simply. They continued on after their brief rest, with Zach now riding behind Eliza, his arms around her waist to hold the reins. He was acutely aware of her presence, the faint scent of river water and wood smoke that clung to her hair, the way she leaned slightly back against his chest when the trail grew steep, the sound of her laugh when Samuel said something amusing. It was a dangerous awareness, he knew. Eliza and her son were under his protection, nothing more. In 2 weeks, he would deliver them safely to Rebecca's boarding house, and that would be the end of it. He had no right to imagine anything else, no matter how the thought of parting from them already created a hollow feeling in his gut. As the afternoon waned, they emerged from the hills into the vast grasslands of the Double R. Cattle dotted the landscape, black specks against the green and gold of the spring grass. In the distance, the ranch buildings clustered around the main house like chicks around a hen. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, gazing across the rolling landscape. "So open." "That it is," Zach agreed. "First time I saw it, I couldn't believe land could stretch so far without a tree in sight. Different from Illinois farm country." They approached the ranch as the sun began to dip toward the western horizon. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the sounds of men's voices and horses nickering carried on the evening air. A few cowboys lounging outside the bunkhouse straightened as Buck plodded into the yard, their expressions curious as they took in the sight of Zach returning with a woman and child. Before any of them could approach, the door of the main house opened, and Harlan Reynolds himself stepped onto the porch. A tall man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and a trimmed beard, he had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the elements. His expression was unreadable as he watched them approach. "Jensen," he called as they drew closer. "Heard you'd taken up river rescue. Didn't know it came with additions." Zach helped Eliza and Samuel dismount before swinging down himself. "Evening, Mr. Reynolds," he said, leading Buck forward. "This is Miss Eliza Davis and her son Samuel." Harlan descended the steps, his eyes sharp as they assessed the newcomers. "Madam," he said with a slight nod to Eliza, who curtsied nervously. Heard there was some trouble in town yesterday. Yes, sir, Zach replied. Miss Davis had a disagreement with Gerald Buchanan. His men were pursuing her when she fell into the river. A disagreement? Harlan raised an eyebrow. That's not how Pete Rollins tells it. I imagine not, Zach said evenly. But I believe Miss Davis's version of events. Harlan studied him for a long moment, then surprisingly, a small smile creased his weathered face. Do you now? He turned to Eliza. May I ask, madam, what exactly transpired between you and old Gerald? Eliza straightened her shoulders, though Zach could see her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Buchanan made improper advances, sir. When I refused him, he accused me of theft to save his reputation. Harlan nodded slowly. Sounds like Gerald, all right. Man's been a widower too long, forgets how to behave around decent women. He glanced at Zach. So you fished them out of the river, then what? Bringing them to me for employment? Not exactly, sir, Zach said. I'm planning to escort Miss Davis and her son to Bozeman, to my sister's boarding house. They can't return to Riverton now. Bozeman? Harlan frowned. That's 2 weeks' ride, Jensen. Spring roundup starts in 3 days. I know, sir. I was hoping you might spare me for a month. I've never asked for time off before. Harlan's frown deepened. No, you haven't. Been one of my most reliable hands for 5 years. He sighed, looking between Zach and Eliza. Mrs. Flores. He called toward the cookhouse. A plump, gray-haired woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. See, Senor Reynolds? We have guests for dinner, and they'll need a place to sleep tonight. Of course, Mrs. Flores said, her kind eyes taking in Eliza and Samuel with immediate understanding. The lady and her niño can have the spare room in my quarters. And Jensen? Harlan asked. He can sleep in the bunkhouse where he belongs, she replied with a smile that took any sting from her words. Harlan turned back to Zach. Get your horse settled, then come see me in my office. We need to talk. Yes, sir, Zach said, a knot forming in his stomach. He turned to Eliza. Mrs. Flores will take good care of you. I'll see you at dinner. Eliza nodded, her eyes filled with concern. Thank you, she said to Harlan, for your hospitality. Don't thank me yet, madam, Harlan replied cryptically before returning to the house. Mrs. Flores bustled forward, taking Eliza's arm. Come, come, she said warmly. You look exhausted, Pobrecita. And the niño too. A hot meal and a soft bed. That's what you need. As they walked toward the cookhouse, Samuel looked back over his shoulder at Zach, his small face worried. Zach gave him an encouraging smile and a small wave before leading Buck toward the stables. After seeing to his horse, Zach washed up at the pump outside the bunkhouse, ignoring the curious glances of the other hands. He changed into his spare shirt, brushed as much trail dust as he could from his denims, and made his way to the main house with a sense of foreboding. Harlan's office was at the back of the house, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk. The rancher was seated behind it when Zach entered, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. Sit down, Jensen, Harlan said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. When Zach complied, Harlan poured a second glass of whiskey and pushed it across the desk. Drink that. You look like you need it. Zach accepted the glass but didn't drink immediately. About Miss Davis and her son. I'm not concerned about Miss Davis, Harlan interrupted. Pretty young widow with a child. Running from Gerald Buchanan's wandering hands, nothing unusual there, sadly. He leaned forward. What concerns me is you, Jensen. Sir, 5 years you've worked for me. Never missed a day, never complained, never asked for special treatment. Now suddenly you're ready to abandon your post during the busiest season to escort a woman you just met to Bozeman. Harlan's eyes narrowed. What am I missing? Zach took a sip of whiskey to buy himself time, the liquor burning a path down his throat. Nothing, sir. It's just the right thing to do. The right thing, Harlan repeated. Would you have done the same for an old man? Or an ugly woman? Heat rose in Zach's face. I'd like to think so, yes. But you're not sure. Harlan sat back, studying him. Let me tell you something, Jensen. I've watched many a good cowhand throw away years of solid work over a pretty face. Some work out, most don't. But I've never seen a man more obviously struck than you are right now. Sir, don't bother denying it. It's written all over your face. Harlan took a drink of his own whiskey. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Zach stared at his glass. I gave my word I'd take them to Bozeman. After that, you'll what? Come back here and punch cows for another 5 years while pining for a woman and child hundreds of miles away. Harlan shook his head. I've seen that story play out too. It ends badly. What are you saying, sir? Harlan sighed. I'm saying, Jensen, that sometimes a man needs to recognize when his path is changing. You're a good hand, one of my best. But that look in your eye when you rode in with that woman and her boy, I've seen it before. In the mirror 40 years ago when I met my Caroline. Zach looked up, surprised. In all his years at the Double R, Harlan had rarely spoken of his late wife. One look, that's all it took, Harlan continued, his voice softening with memory. I was supposed to be driving a herd to Cheyenne. Instead, I turned in my notice and bought this land to build a home for her. Are you firing me? Zach asked, confusion replacing his earlier anxiety. Harlan laughed. No, son. I'm giving you permission to follow your heart, if that's what you want to do. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out an envelope. This is your pay plus a bonus. Consider it a wedding present, if it comes to that. Wedding? Sir, I barely know Miss Davis, and she certainly hasn't indicated. Give it time, Harlan said, sliding the envelope across the desk. But not too much time. Life's shorter than you think, Jensen. Take it from an old man who spent 30 good years with the right woman, and 10 lonely ones since she's been gone. Zach took the envelope, his mind reeling. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. Say you'll bring that woman and her boy back to visit sometime, and that you'll think hard about what you really want. Harlan stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Now let's go to dinner. Mrs. Flores will have my hide if we're late. The evening passed in a blur for Zach. Dinner was served in the main dining room, with Harlan at the head of the table, Zach and Eliza on either side of him, and Samuel beside his mother. Mrs. Flores had outdone herself, preparing roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and even an apple pie for dessert. Throughout the meal, Zach found his eyes drawn repeatedly to Eliza. Mrs. Flores had lent her a clean dress, slightly too large but far better than her river-damaged garment. Her hair was neatly pinned, and a touch of color had returned to her cheeks. She spoke easily with Harlan, her natural grace and intelligence evident in her conversation. Samuel, too, seemed to be blossoming in the safe, warm environment. He answered Harlan's gentle questions about his interests, growing animated when the rancher promised to show him the new calves in the morning. After dinner, when Samuel had been put to bed in Mrs. Flores's spare room, Eliza joined Zach on the porch. The spring night was mild, the sky ablaze with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Your employer is very kind, Eliza said, standing beside Zach at the porch railing. Not at all what I expected. Harlan surprises most people, Zach agreed. Tough but fair. He spoke highly of you, she continued. Said you're one of his best men. Zach shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I do my job. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional lowing of cattle in the distant fields, the soft murmur of men's voices from the bunkhouse. "Will you be in trouble for taking us to Bozeman?" Eliza asked finally. "It's the busiest season," he said. "No," Zach replied. "Harlan's given his blessing. We can leave in the morning, if you're rested enough." Eliza turned to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight. "Why are you doing this, Zach? Why help us? Two strangers who've brought nothing but complication into your life." The question caught him off guard, though he'd been asking himself the same thing since pulling them from the river. The answer that rose to his lips surprised him with its simple truth. "Because from the moment I saw you in that river, fighting to reach your son even though the current was dragging you down, I knew you were someone worth helping." He paused, gathering courage. "And because I can't bear the thought of not knowing what becomes of you both." Eliza's eyes widened slightly, and for a terrible moment, Zach thought he'd said too much, too soon. Then she stepped closer, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm. "I've been alone since Thomas died," she said softly. "Raising Samuel, moving west, trying to build a life for us. I've done it all alone because I had to. But yesterday, when you pulled us from that river, when you said you weren't losing two lives today." She drew a shaky breath. "For the first time in years, I felt like maybe I didn't have to be alone anymore." Zach covered her hand with his own. "You don't," he said simply. Their eyes held, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of possibilities, of futures neither had imagined before yesterday. The journey to Bozeman took 12 days rather than the expected 14, partly due to good weather, partly due to Zach's eagerness to reach their destination. Each day brought them closer not just to Rebecca's boarding house, but to a deeper understanding of one another. They established a comfortable routine, breaking camp at dawn, riding until midday, stopping for a brief rest, then continuing until late afternoon. Each evening, Zach would hunt or fish for their supper, while Eliza prepared the fire and kept Samuel entertained. The boy flourished under Zach's gentle attention, his natural curiosity finding an encouraging outlet. Zach taught him to identify animal tracks, to whistle through a blade of grass, to spot constellations in the night sky. In return, Samuel offered his complete trust and admiration, following Zach like a faithful shadow whenever they made camp. "He's never had a father figure," Eliza confided one evening as they watched Samuel attempt to skip stones across a pond. "Thomas never even got to hold him. He died 3 months before Samuel was born." "He's a remarkable child," Zach said. "You've done an amazing job raising him on your own." Eliza smiled, her eyes on her son. "I've done my best, but seeing him with you, it reminds me of what he's missed." On the 10th day of their journey, as they made camp in a small meadow surrounded by pines, Zach finally found the courage to voice the thoughts that had been building since their conversation on Harlan's porch. "What will you do in Bozeman?" he asked as they sat beside the fire, Samuel already asleep in the tent Zach had purchased in the last town they'd passed through. Eliza looked up from her mending. She was repairing a tear in Samuel's shirt with thread Mrs. Flores had given her. "Work at your sister's boarding house, I suppose. Save money. Eventually find a place of our own." "And if there was another option?" Zach asked, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she must hear it. "What sort of option?" Zach set aside the stick he'd been whittling and moved to sit beside her on the fallen log. "Eliza, I know we've only known each other a short time, but these past days, they've been the happiest I can remember." She set down her mending, her eyes meeting his. "For me as well," she said softly. "I'm not a wealthy man," he continued. "I have some savings and Harlan's bonus. Enough to buy a small place, maybe. Not a grand ranch like the Double R, but land of our own." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I'm asking if you and Samuel might consider a future that includes me. Not just as an escort to Bozeman, but as family. Eliza's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. Zach, are you proposing? Inelegantly, but yes, he admitted with a nervous laugh. I love you, Eliza. I think I've loved you since I saw you fighting that river to reach your son. And I love Samuel too, like he was my own. I know it's fast, and if you need time, she silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. It is fast, she agreed, and by all conventional wisdom foolish. A smile bloomed on her face, transforming it in the firelight. But I've never felt more certain of anything. Yes, Zach. Yes, we want a future with you. The kiss they shared was tender at first, then deepening with a passion that had been building since that first day by the river. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Zach rested his forehead against hers. I promise I'll do everything I can to make you and Samuel happy, he whispered. You already have, she replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You saved us in more ways than one. 2 days later, they rode into Bozeman, a growing town of wooden buildings and dusty streets nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains. Rebecca's boarding house was on the eastern edge of town, a 2-story structure with a neat front porch and window boxes filled with spring flowers. Rebecca Jensen Parker, 2 years Zach's senior, was sweeping the porch when they arrived. She dropped her broom with a cry of delight when she recognized her brother, rushing down the steps to greet him. Zachariah Jensen, you scoundrel! She exclaimed, embracing him tightly. Not a letter in 6 months, and then you appear out of nowhere. She pulled back, noticing Eliza and Samuel for the first time, and with company, no less. Zach grinned, helping Eliza down from Buck's back before lifting Samuel to the ground. Becca, this is Eliza Davis and her son, Samuel. Eliza, Samuel, this is my sister, Rebecca. Rebecca's shrewd eyes took in the way Zach's hand lingered on Eliza's waist, the way Samuel stood close to Zach's side. A knowing smile spread across her face. Well, now, this is interesting. Come inside, all of you. I want to hear everything. Over coffee and fresh baked bread in Rebecca's cozy kitchen, Zach and Eliza told their story, the river rescue, their journey, and finally, their plans for the future. Married, Rebecca repeated, beaming. My wandering brother, finally settling down? Oh, Mama would be so pleased. She turned to Eliza, taking her hands. And I couldn't be happier with his choice. Any woman brave enough to survive what you have, and still have such kindness in her eyes, is welcome in our family. Thank you, Eliza said, squeezing Rebecca's hands gratefully. Your acceptance means everything. And you, young man, Rebecca said to Samuel, who was shyly eating a cookie, are going to be very popular with your cousins. They've been wanting a new playmate. As if on cue, the back door burst open, and 2 boys tumbled in, one about 10. The other 8 followed by a tall man with sandy hair and friendly eyes. Uncle Zach. The boys cried in unison, launching themselves at him. Zach laughed, catching them both in a hug. Look at you 2 grown a foot since I saw you last. The man stepped forward, offering his hand. Good to see you, Zach. You too, Frank, Zach replied, clasping his brother-in-law's hand. Meet Eliza and Samuel, my future wife and son. If Frank was surprised by this announcement, he didn't show it. Welcome to the family, he said warmly. Any plans for where you'll settle? Not yet, Zach admitted. I thought we'd stay in town for a bit, look for land in the area. Frank and Rebecca exchanged glances. Actually, Frank said, Old Man Henderson's place just came up for sale. 300 acres, decent house, good water. Been empty since he passed last winter. Henderson's, Zach raised his eyebrows. That's a fine piece of land. And not far from town, Rebecca added. Just 4 miles west. The boys could visit their cousins often. She smiled at Samuel, who was watching the older boys with fascination. It sounds perfect, Eliza said, looking at Zach. If we can afford it. We'll find out tomorrow, Zach promised, his heart light with possibility. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church on Bozeman's Main Street. Rebecca had helped Eliza sew a simple wedding dress of cream-colored cotton, adorned with lace from Rebecca's own wedding gown. Samuel, scrubbed and solemn in new clothes, stood beside them throughout the ceremony, holding the ring on a small pillow until the minister asked for it. I never thought I'd find love again, Eliza said softly as they exchanged vows. You gave me hope when I had none, and courage when I was afraid. I promise to love you faithfully for all my days. You and Samuel are the family I never dared dream of, Zach replied, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. I promise to protect you, provide for you, and love you both with everything I am, for as long as I live. The small church erupted in cheers when they were pronounced husband and wife, with Samuel adding his high, clear voice to the celebration. The Henderson place became the Jensen Ranch, with Zach and Frank spending the summer repairing fences, strengthening the barn, and preparing fields for crops. Eliza planted a vegetable garden beside the house and transformed the dusty interior into a warm, welcoming home. Samuel started school in the fall, riding to town with his cousins on a gentle pony Zach had trained especially for him. 1 year to the day after the river rescue, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple, Eliza took Zach's hand and placed it gently on her belly. I have news, she said, her eyes shining with happiness. Zach's face lit with wonder as understanding dawned. A baby? We're having a baby? Eliza nodded, laughing as he pulled her into a gentle embrace. Due in winter, the doctor says. Samuel is ecstatic about becoming a big brother. I can imagine, Zach said, his voice thick with emotion. He'll be wonderful at it. He gazed out at the rolling land of their ranch, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the stream that cut through their property glinting in the last rays of sunlight. 1 year ago, I was just a lonely cowhand with no real direction. Now look at us. All because you couldn't stand by and watch a woman and child drown, Eliza said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Best decision I ever made, Zach murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. I meant what I said that day. I wasn't losing 2 lives then, and I'm never going to lose either of you now. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together in contented silence, the promise of their future stretching before them like the vast Montana landscape wild and beautiful, and theirs to shape together.